everyone. This is John Briggs, Head of Strategy in the Americas.
Hi, and I'm Brian Dangerfield, Head of G10 FX Strategy here in the U.S.
We're here today to introduce our first in a series of 2020 U.S. election podcasts. Today we're going to start off with looking at the Democratic primary. Now, it seems a little bit early to be doing all of this, but interest in the election process and even in the primaries themselves is growing rapidly, so we thought we would bring some color to the subject. So, Brian, like I said, the election isn't until November. Why do we even care about the Democratic primary at this point?
Well, I mean, the 2020 election is almost certainly going to be the major issue in markets this year. I mean, so many global themes are so closely linked with President Trump that the possibility of President Trump no longer being president in 2021 and later is significant, whether it be global growth divergence, the presence of various trade wars, disruptions in oil supply and policy. All of that is certainly keenly linked to President Trump. And so it's very important who he's running against, because that's going to influence market expectations for who's going to win in 2020. And certainly from a policy perspective, there are key differences among candidates.
So what about, we talk about those key differences. We look at it versus progressives like Warren or Sanders, and how they'll have a very different policy approach versus, your more, it's called the moderate Democrats of Biden or Buttigieg. I mean, how do you think one or either of those would impact the markets at this point?
Well, I think taking a step back for a moment, any Democratic candidate will be significantly different from President Trump, who has one of the most business-friendly administrations really in modern history. And we could go from overnight to a very business-friendly administration to an extremely unfriendly business administration. Certainly more so on the progressive side, considering progressive candidates, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren primarily, are proposing very significant changes both to the tax code and to the regulatory picture. To a lesser extent, former Vice President Biden and Buttigieg, but both are proposing a pretty significant move back in the pro-regulatory direction, one that we think is pretty significant from a market perspective.
Yeah, so I agree with you that, especially on the policies on the progressive side. We looked at Warren's top 4 proposals, for example, and they would pretty radically change industries that account for $20 trillion in market cap, banning fracking, major changes to healthcare, that kind of thing. But that said, I don't think markets have begun to handicap it yet. I think that's fair given it's so early and the national polls are still really close.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at Iowa, for example, the first poll, the first state election, the top 4 candidates are really running neck and neck. And we think about this election as much from a individual candidate perspective as from an ideological perspective. So if you sum the polling between Buttigieg and Biden, who are really the top 2, call it establishment Democratic candidates, compared to Sanders and Warren, they're actually running very close. So from a ideological perspective and from a actual polling perspective, this is certainly a very close election.
Yeah, so the latest numbers actually have the 2 moderate candidates nationally summing to 36% and the 2 progressives summing 35%. So it is really neck and neck. And I think this is important just to add some context because, a Sanders voter is very unlikely to switch over to Biden and vice versa. So if we get through the primaries and say, Warren starts to move lower, we do expect, her votes more likely than not to head towards Sanders. So you could see, a winnowing of the race, but not a decision or not a determination on kind of the progressive versus moderate thing. And also, just to give the readers some backdrop, we do have the Iowa Caucus on February 3rd, so it is coming up. The reason why we watch Iowa closely, though, is not because it has a huge amount of delegates. You need 1,990 Democratic delegates in order to win the nomination. Iowa only has 41. But we do believe pretty strongly that Iowa creates a lot of momentum for the winner. And on the other hand, for the loser, creates a lot of potential for their supporters to start to shift to one of the more winning candidates. Presumably, this is going to be receiving a lot more positive attention from the media. And the national nightly news hasn't been particularly covering speeches and rallies in a lot of these states, but the winner of Iowa will see a lot of coverage. Best example of this is back in 2008, Hillary Clinton was polling between 5 and 12 points higher than Barack Obama, but Barack Obama had a surprise win in Iowa, along with a pretty impressive speech. So right after the Iowa caucus, he polled very even with Clinton, and the race was on. So, nationally, while polling is close, we do think this could be an important caucus or primary decision here. If the progressives win, it could have a big impact on markets, and that could see some risk-off type moves in the market.
Yeah, definitely. To summarize that point, really, we think the election is going to be very momentum-based, that the winner in the early states can really set themselves up in a strong position leading into Super Tuesday, so March 3rd, the key date when most of the delegates are going to be awarded. But ahead of that Super Tuesday date, we've discussed Iowa specifically, but there are actually 3 other states that are holding polls, and each one has their own intricacies that make them important for different ways. So after Iowa, we'll see New Hampshire, a northeastern state. It's a neighboring state to both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' home states. Bernie Sanders won comfortably over Hillary Clinton in 2016 in this state. For him in particular, I think New Hampshire is an important state, even though it's a low delegate count. Moving on to South Carolina and Nevada, the next 2 states before Super Tuesday, those are the first states on the calendar with a significant proportion of the population that are made up of minority voters. So this is an important demographic for Democratic candidates, and doing well in these states might position one of the candidates, looks like Biden is polling very well in both of those states, might put a bit more momentum under Biden if he can match those polling numbers into Super Tuesday, given the importance of minority voters for the Democratic base.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm looking at on kind of more the negative momentum side is if, say, Sanders or Warren, given their neighboring in New Hampshire, if they do poorly in Iowa and then do poorly in states that they arguably should do better in, it could be an early death knell for one of those campaigns. Now, of course, we can have very mixed results, but again, the momentum on both sides of this is going to be pretty important. And then, as you said, Brian, you got Super Tuesday. So of that 1,990 delegates you need, 1,350 are decided. So you've got some pretty big states there. And in both the GOP and the Democratic history, 17 of the last 18 Super Tuesdays ended up winning the nomination. Do you think that this will be the case again, that the race is going to be decided by March 3rd?
So because momentum is so important, I think the market's going to have a strong sense of who the candidate will be. I think there's generally because the race is so close this late, there isn't a defined frontrunner at the moment. I think it increases the possibility that you don't have that certainty going through Super Tuesday. Right now on Predicted, for example, there's about a 1 in 3 odds for what we call brokered convention, which is when you don't have a nominee by the time the convention happens in July. Again, momentum is going to be extremely important, and polls will shift based on what happens in these early states, and certainly through Super Tuesday. I think there's a pretty strong chance that we end up with a much more clear frontrunner coming out of that time. But it's worth noting that in 2008, in the Democratic primary, Clinton did not concede to Obama until June 3rd. And so there was still that uncertainty all the way through into the early stages of the summer.
Yeah, and I think that for me, I think it actually is probably a little bit more likely that you have a clear front runner this time around, just because it feels like through all of those states, all of the month of February, you should have one of the ideologies posting, a stronger performance than the other. That said, as we've seen with politics, nothing's predictable lately, either here or globally. So it would not surprise me at all to have that uncertainty lingering out into the summer, which means market uncertainty and potentially more volatility could come. But as far as that market goes, this takes us a little bit back to the beginning, which is why we think investors should start paying much more closer attention. So Brian, let's just say the progressives start to show very strongly, and it looks like that's going to become the progressive candidate has increased odds. Again, things can change, but if the markets become concerned that a progressive candidate is going to take the lead, how do you think the markets are going to move?
Well, I think if we can pull it back to President Trump first and say, for President Trump, the corporate bottom line is really his top line, that he is a very business-friendly candidate, and the market has a sense that Trump's policies will adjust to prevent declines in equity markets. So from an equity market perspective, the possibility of the significant change from a regulatory and tax perspective, but generally the loss of the so-called Trump put is something that leaves a risk negative, we think we'll have a risk negative reaction if you do start to get progressive candidates moving higher heading into and through Super Tuesday. If a progressive candidate were to gain that momentum, we think the market would take it with a generally risk-off tone.
Okay. Well, that's it from us for now. We plan to be doing another update between now and Super Tuesday and see how things have shifted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.